back to another episode with Divorce Well in Florida. What to know before your spouse does. I'm Matthew Waring.
And I'm Brian Dunmire.
And today we're coming at you with an episode about what to do before you get divorced in Florida. And again, Brian and I are both partners in the law firm Fairway Law Group. We're a Florida divorce law firm. But before we dive into it, Brian, I got to know, how was your weekend in Margaritaville?
Of course, you got to ask me that question. For those of you listening, my son is on spring break, so my wife booked us a very nice Airbnb over in the Bradenton area of Florida. It ended up being at a Margaritaville development. It was extremely nice. You know, you go to those Margaritaville, and I'm a huge Jimmy Buffett fan.
Rest in peace. Rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace. I was actually in Boston, which he spent some time in Boston on the day that he died in late August, I believe it was, or early September. And, you know, I love Jimmy, but you think about the Margaritaville stuff and you'd imagine it's kind of tacky, but man, it's just nice. They do a good job.
Yeah, I've stayed at the hotel up in Jacksonville a couple times. I guess it's called the Margaritaville. I don't know. But it's the Jimmy Buffett's hotel up in Jacksonville, and everything is very well done. It's got just the right amount of tackiness to it so that you know that you're not staying at a regular hotel. They have a bar there. It's obviously called the Land Shark, obviously. So, yeah, if we live in Florida. It's like Margaritaville down here, 365 days a year.
Yeah. One last thing I'll say, and then we can get into the podcast. It was the same thing at the condos. It was really well done. They were very, very nice condos. The condo we stayed in was very nice. But then you get off the elevator, and the building's called the Changes in Latitudes building. And, you know, the next building over is Changes in Attitudes.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, one building's called Fins Right. Another building's called Fins Left. So it's like
just enough. Just
enough.
All right, Brian, what do people need to know before they get divorced in Florida?
This is a great topic for us to discuss, and there's so many different ways to go about it. You know, we could talk about what you need to know as it relates to what a divorce will actually accomplish, because some people call and say, oh, I want to claim in attorney speak damages, but I want money from my wife. I want money from my husband because they slandered me. It's not really a divorce. On the flip side of things, what to do, what to prepare for the divorce. And prepare for the divorce is interesting because you can't really do too much differently than you typically do. Don't think you're going to be able to transfer a bunch of assets and make them go bye-bye. And we'll talk about that a lot in depth. But why don't I toss it back to you, and we can actually just start with that, Matt. When it comes to assets and, you know, somebody's thought that, oh, I've got $50,000 in the savings account and I'm just going to transfer it to my dad or to my mom or a friend or somebody. What's your advice, or what are kind of your observations on that?
Don't. It's easy to start. It's easy. We're going to talk about what to do before divorce, what you could do before divorce to maybe put you in a better situation. But honestly, what's much more important is what not to do before you get a divorce. Do not start hiding assets, transferring money, opening up new bank accounts. Don't cancel your spouse's car insurance. Don't cut off their cell phone. Everything has to be status quo. All these counties in Florida, most of them, they have standing orders, and it's going to relate back to your conduct that you did before getting a divorce, before you even filed. You can't start taking people's names off of stuff. You can't try to hide assets. We have this thing called mandatory disclosure in Florida. It's mandatory. It's not optional disclosure. It's mandatory. You know, they're going to get a year or two of bank statements, credit card statements, tax returns, business tax returns, business bank account statements. We're going to be able to see what you did with the money. And if you're out there trying to hide it, trying to shuffle it around, it's just going to end up looking bad for you. You're going to lose credibility with the judge. and it's going to make your divorce even more costly. So even though you're thinking that you're going to hide some money so that you could save some, you're going to end up spending it, and it's still going to be divided. So just leave things how they are in the normal course of business for the marriage before you file for divorce.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So you definitely, I use this example with clients because it's very clear to understand this. Don't go to Las Vegas and spend $50,000 on red unless you've done that your entire course of the marriage. If that's something that you do every month and you've done it for 10 years and it's normal, then by all means go for it. I'd probably tell you not to, but if it's in the normal course of the marriage, that's fine. But if you've never been to Vegas and you just think, hey, I've got nothing else to lose, let me just go out there and throw $50,000 on red, and then you lose it, guess what? You're going to be credited with that, not in a good way. You're going to be credited with that money at the end of the divorce. It's something called an intentional dissipation of marital assets. And that's when the court says, yeah, you spend the money and you don't have the money, but your wife or your husband, your spouse was entitled to half of it. You spent it, so now you owe it to them. So then you lose the money and you got to come up with half of it to give your spouse. So this whole, I'm just going to burn down the entire house because if I can't have it, she can't have it, or if I can't have it, he can't have it. That mentality just doesn't work. And this is one of the questions that we get all the time. What should I do before divorce? There are some specific things like we just discussed, not dissipating marital assets. But then there also are some other general things. And that is the court system isn't a magic genie that's just going to fix all of your problems overnight. And that goes to understanding how the court system and judges work. And if you've listened to one episode, this is something that I say on virtually every single episode. Don't assume just because you go in front of a judge, the judge is going to necessarily agree with you, even if in your brain you can't see how you lose. And that's really important to understand before divorce, because if possible, the best thing that you can do is try to maintain some sort of relationship with your spouse. Because the more that you're able to work out with them and come to an agreement, whether it's something an agreement you really like, or an agreement where you kind of shrug your shoulders and you begrudgingly say, whatever, I didn't really care about that car anyways, or something like that. If you can come to an agreement, it's going to reduce the attorney's fees, it's going to reduce the time, it's going to reduce the court appearances, it's going to create certainty in a very uncertain time that you're going through. And it's much better than relying on a judge to tell you how to split up a car, or country club membership, or whatever your situation might be. And the way that you do that starts at the beginning. Just because you can get nasty with your spouse, just because you can send them nasty text messages, just because you can, make threats. Certainly, you shouldn't be making any physical threats by any stretch of the imagination. But just because you can't make threats, you're gonna lose everything in the divorce or anything, doesn't mean that it necessarily serves any purpose. You're just adding fuel to a fire. So sometimes we talk to clients and the relationship with their spouse, it's gone. There's just no way to fix it, whether it's through the client's actions or the spouse's actions. And that's certainly out there, and we understand that. But if you're in the majority of the situation to where it's y'all just aren't getting along, you're not going out to dinner, not going out on Valentine's Day, that's perfectly understandable. But if you can just maintain some sort of working relationship, and this is especially true, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back over to Matt. This is especially true for the kids, which we could talk about for hours. But don't think in short-term time horizons. Don't think about next week, next month. Think about the long-term time horizons, especially if you have young kids. If your kids are 1, 2 years old, you're going to be dealing with your spouse until your kids turn 18. You're going to have to deal with parenting plan. You're going to have to deal with child support for 14, 15, 16 years, sometimes 17 or even close to 18 years, depending on how young your kid is when you're getting divorced. And if you're just throwing fuel on a fire, more or less from day one, it's going to make for a really rough decade that doesn't need to be. It doesn't mean you guys have to be best friends, but if you can just have some sort of working relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, having a working relationship is key if you can. It's not possible in all situations, and it's okay if it's not the best thing to do if you don't have a good working relationship is to just have no relationship and have no contact. A lot of people think that they're not able to leave the home, that if they leave the home, there's going to be some negative consequences. And we'll talk about what leaving the home before filing a divorce means. But let me first talk about what abandonment is. I hear it all the time. People say that because their, husband left the house, they've abandoned the marriage. And now as a result, they think that they're going to get full custody with the kids. They think they're going to get the house, and they think that they've just completely hit a jackpot. That's not what abandonment is. That's not how abandonment works. Abandonment is when somebody leaves the marriage and does not contribute financially at all to the marriage, just completely just leaves, gone, doesn't pay bills, stops seeing the kids, and just is on the run. That's abandonment. And when somebody abandons a marriage, it is not going to give the other spouse who remains in the home, who remains with the kids, it doesn't automatically give them a huge one-up on equitable distribution, on who gets the house or who gets the bank accounts. Those things still need to be equitably distributed. And in Florida, there's that presumption that equitable is going to be that 50-50 split. If somebody does abandon the marriage, that will affect child custody. That is a factor that the judges and the courts will consider when determining who gets primary time sharing and decision-making power over the kids. So, but removing yourself from a bad situation, a bad marriage, you just can't stand to be around your spouse anymore. So you move in with your mom, or you move in with your sister, or you go out and you rent an apartment, or, whatever it is, you get out of the house. You're allowed to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a good thing to do in a lot of situations to try to avoid some sort of altercation or, some flare up where there could hopefully not be, but sometimes like a domestic violence situation, or maybe you don't want to argue with your spouse in front of the children, so you should just decide to leave. That's fine. However, you still have an obligation to your children. You still have an obligation to your spouse to pay the bills and make financial contributions in the same way that you had previously during the marriage. If you just leave, you go out, you rent an apartment, you don't contribute financially back to the marital home, you just stop paying bills, or, you move out and you cancel your wife's car insurance and cell phone, that is going to be abandonment. So you can remove yourself from the situation, but you can't stop contributing financially. And the one last thing on that is, a lot of people also think that, like I covered before, leaving the house means that they're never going to get the house. That's not true. If it's a marital home, even if you leave, it's still going to be equitably distributed. However, if you do leave the house, it's going to be much more difficult for you to get exclusive use and possession of the home during the divorce case.
Yeah, excuse me. That's definitely true. And the other part about leaving the house, you certainly can leave the house, and you're not screwing yourself, so to speak. You hear that phrase from time to time. But this all goes back to why it might be in your best interest to have some sort of working relationship with your spouse. Because assuming that you and your spouse make somewhat equal money, or close to thereabouts, if you leave the marital home, the best thing to do would be to have that discussion with your spouse. Hey, this just isn't working. I don't really think that we should be living together. So I think it's best if I move out. I'm going to get an apartment. I'm going to find a rental house. Maybe you're in a position to where you can buy a new house. I'm going to do something. And the issue that comes from that, though, is that a lot of the standing family law orders in the state of Florida, virtually any county that has a standing family law order, says that you have to maintain the status quo with the finances after a divorce. And nobody's going to fault you, or you're not going to get sanctioned by a court because you moved into an apartment. That's not what the issue is. The issue is that if you move into an apartment and you just kind of do it on your own accord, you just decided to do it, and you incur that 12, 15, $1,800 a month liability, that's fine. You can pay for it. But you're still responsible for the status quo of the finances during the course of the marriage. So it starts to get real tricky because you've got two people getting divorced, and it's completely reasonable that you can't live under the same roof. Nobody questions that. But then one of the spouses goes out and gets an apartment, and they incur that $1,800 of debt, which maybe they can afford just fine. But then naturally, the next step is, I don't want to have to pay the mortgage anymore, or I can't contribute to the mortgage anymore. And that's where it can get a little tricky. And then if that doesn't get resolved before the attorneys get involved and the court gets involved, then we're all kind of left scratching our heads thinking, what's the best course of action here? Do we need to file a motion with the court saying, hey, my client lives in an apartment now and she can't afford to contribute towards a mortgage anymore? Well, naturally, if you do go in front of a judge, the judge is going to say, okay, did you have an agreement to move out? No. Well, why did you move out? I didn't really like him. Okay, so you incurred a debt because you didn't like the guy? Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so now you think just because you can't be under the same roof, it's okay to incur that debt and then cause your ex-spouse or your soon-to-be ex-spouse to pay the mortgage all alone. And although that's kind of reasonable, it's kind of a shot in the dark what the judge is going to do on that. I mean, the judge could say, no, you moved out and there was no domestic violence, there was no threat, you guys just weren't getting along, and there's no problem with you moving out, but you still have to contribute to the mortgage. Or the judge could say, yeah, that's reasonable. I mean, you guys make about the same amount, so you don't have to pay the mortgage anymore. But regardless, you're left kind of in this purgatory where it's, what do we really do here? And that could all be avoided if you have that working relationship, not a great relationship, but just a working relationship with your spouse. And you just say, hey, how about you just take the mortgage and I take an apartment, and then we'll just keep a tally of how much you pay on the mortgage. And then on the back end, we'll correct it or we'll account for that in equitable distribution. It doesn't need to be a huge, long, notarized document, legal form, or anything like that, but it would probably behoove you to get that in an email or something. Hey, John, this is just to confirm, just so we have something in writing. January 1st, I'm going to move out and get an apartment. It's going to be $1,800 a month. You'll pay the mortgage, and whenever this case resolves or the divorce finalizes, you'll get the credit for paying the full mortgage for the 6 months or however long the divorce might take. And that is the cleanest way to do it. And if you take nothing away from this podcast other than that, you're going to be light years ahead when you do find yourself in that situation, because that's something that we find very consistently. Now, on the flip side of things, if you are in a domestic violence situation, or there's alcohol or some legitimate threat of bodily harm, or there's kids around and your husband's a drunk and throwing stuff, I mean, yeah, you got to do what you got to do. Get out of that situation and we'll figure it out after. If there's any chance to figure it out before, you're going to be absolutely light years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we also get these situations where people are on the flip side, where their spouse is, maybe they're having an affair, they've mentally checked out of the marriage, they're just done, they're ready to move on, they're going to go out and rent an apartment, and maybe you're a stay-at-home mom, and you're really worried about being cut off financially. Who's going to pay these bills? You don't have any income, you're completely dependent on your husband, and your husband's having an affair and he's going to go move out. He has an obligation to continue to pay the bills. However, if you don't have a divorce case filed and he cuts you off financially, you don't have any, the court's jurisdiction is not invoked. Even though he shouldn't be doing it, he can. And there's nothing that you can do about it. And, you might lose your home, you could lose your cell phone, you could lose your car, your credit could be damaged, and there's nothing you can do because you haven't filed a divorce case. So a lot of times what happens is people kind of cling on to the hope of reconciliation, even when there's been an adultery, and they delay on filing the divorce case. And then what happens is the other spouse cuts them off financially that they were dependent on, and now they can't pay bills. They don't know what they're going to do. And then by that point, it's too late, because you still have to file a divorce case in order to get the court's jurisdiction invoked, to then file motions for temporary relief, to try to get spousal support and try to argue that your spouse abandoned the marriage and that they owe you money, or they should at least keep paying your bills while the divorce case continues. But guess what? That's not going to be an emergency. It's going to be an emergency to you, but it's not going to be an emergency to the court. It doesn't involve any threat or imminent danger to children, for example. So you're not going to be able to get a hearing for 2-3 months. So that's another 2 or 3 months that you have to wait before you can get any sort of relief coming your way. So it's much better to have the divorce case filed before your spouse cuts you off financially. That way, the standing law orders are going to apply. If they do cut you off, you can file motions for contempt. You can file motions for temporary relief, and you already have the court's jurisdiction. It's going to shorten the amount of time that you have to go between when you get cut off and when you actually start getting some more money flowing your way during the divorce process. So if I have any advice to anybody who's listening to this, think carefully. Don't wait until you get cut off financially. If you're the dependent spouse, don't wait until you get cut off financially and your other spouse abandons the marriage to file that divorce petition. If you know you're going to get divorced, it's better to just rip that Band-Aid off and get that petition filed sooner rather than later, so that you actually have the court's jurisdiction invoked, so that you have remedies available, and it's going to stop your spouse from cutting you off financially.
Yeah, and that's another thing on kind of a related note. Just for anybody who's listening, there's really no benefit to being the first person to file for divorce. We get those phone calls from time to time. Do I need to file first, or can she file first, or if my husband files first, does he get any advantage? There's really no advantage one way or the other. There's some real specific things. If you're the second person to file, filing fees may be a little bit less. You don't have to get service of process. There's some benefits to actually being the second person, the respondent. But as it relates to just who files first, that doesn't make any difference in the actual substantive application of the law. So you don't need to worry about that or lose any sleep about that. But like Matt just said, if you're the dependent spouse, a lot of times it's, my husband gives me, or my wife gives me $2,000 allowance. I don't know, whatever it's called in adult language. Okay. My husband puts $2,000 a month in my checking account, or my wife puts $3,000 a month in my checking account, or something along those lines. If you know that you're going to get divorced, you definitely want to just rip the Band-Aid off while you have at least a little bit of money in there, because you're not going to be able, whether it's with our law firm or any other law firm, and I'm sorry if this is tacky, but you're not going to be able to get an attorney unless you pay the retainer amount. And if you get completely cut off financially, it's going to be hard for you to pay that retainer amount without incurring a credit card debt, or reaching out to friends or family or something along those lines. So if you have the money and you're right, you just need that kind of last push to rip the Band-Aid off. That alone is worth it. And then the other thing is, if you are a dependent spouse thinking about getting a divorce, or right on the verge of getting a divorce, one of the things you're going to want to do with the initial filing, with the answer, or very shortly thereafter, is move for some sort of temporary relief, temporary spousal relief. And that's going to apply if your wife's a doctor and you're a stay-at-home dad and you haven't worked in 10 years, and You don't really know where you're going to get any money or anything, and your wife's going to cut you off, or vice versa. Your husband's going to cut you off. You can petition the court for temporary spousal relief and get your two, three, four, five, $10,000 a month, whatever the status quo was. But number one, it's going to take some time because that's almost certainly going to be an evidentiary hearing. So it's going to take time to get on the court's calendars. Right now, it varies county by county, but for 1 2 hour long hearings, I'm seeing 2 months minimum. I mean, more realistically, 3 to 4 months when you start working in attorney's calendar, judge's calendar, client's calendar. So it's not going to happen overnight, and it can create a very difficult situation for you. And then the other thing that you'll need to do before you get to that hearing, and it's a little bit outside of the scope of this podcast, but is you're going to need to get your financial affidavit in before the hearing on the motion for temporary relief. So all of that takes time. So if you're the dependent spouse and you're looking for, you're looking for something to just say, I just need that guiding light to let me know that it's time to file for a divorce, definitely sooner rather than later if you're the dependent spouse, so that you can invoke the court's jurisdiction so you can get some remedies if they're available to you. Shifting gears to cases with kids, I cannot stress the importance of trying to be supportive to your children when you're going through a divorce, because regardless of what age they are, starting, maybe if they're 6 months or a year, they don't really know what's going on. But if you have a child that's 6 months or a year, that, especially when they get to that 2 or 3 year stage, even though they might not know exactly what's going on, they still know that there's a mom and a dad and they're coming home and everything. So, and then obviously it just gets a little bit more complex as the child gets older, explaining to a 13-year-old that mommy and daddy are getting a divorce or whatever it might be. And Matt and I have gone to conferences on co-parenting. Just one of those things. It's not perfect. It will never be perfect. But from a child's perspective, you can explain to them it means 2 Christmases. It means 2 Thanksgivings. It means 2 birthday parties. You can kind of the cliche things you can say to them. But from a child's perspective, all they care about are their parents. And if you and your spouse, if you and your wife, or you and your husband, are fighting and talking smack about each other to the children, which I would implore you not to do, it's just going to have terrible ramifications on the child. And I'm not going to sit here and say that every single child needs to go to a therapist who's going through a divorce. That's only something that the parents can figure out for themselves, whatever you think is appropriate for your child. Different children act differently. But it definitely would behoove you to try to, again, get that relationship established with your spouse, moving from husband and wife to co-parents, and understand that yes, you might be fighting about a house. Yes, you might be fighting about a 401k. Yes, you might be fighting about a Robinhood brokerage account or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, you got to separate that and be a freaking adult and do what's in the best interest of your child. Okay? Don't make unfounded allegations against your spouse to try and increase your time sharing. Okay? Because that's just going to come back to harm the kids. Don't do things against your spouse out of spite, because that's just going to harm the kids. Certainly do not talk about the divorce case or court or proceedings or stipulations or any of that legalese crap that we use as attorneys with your kid. However you explain it to your kid is up to you. You're their parent. You know them best. But hey, mommy and daddy just aren't getting along, so daddy's going to go move across the street. He's going to live around the corner. I'm still going to be, I'm still dropping you off at school, and I love you, and daddy's still picking you up, and he loves you, and we're both here. Okay? That's the type of way that you need to be communicating with your kids, not your dad and I are entering into a stipulation so that because we can't agree on who's seen who, because again, co-parenting is never going to be perfect, and I'm not going to sit here and say that it's better than having two parents living together in a loving house or anything along those lines. But you can make it pretty darn close to good relationships. And if you have that relationship with your spouse, there's no reason why mom and dad can't have dinner together at wherever it might be, Chili's or something, with the kid, and enjoy that time together with the kid or whatever. So as you're preparing for a divorce, just really think through that. And then I straight away, so let me go back to the thought on therapy. There are therapists out there who specialize in co-parenting, and if you are in a position financially or through health insurance or something along those lines, I would strongly suggest even just one visit, just to get some pointers, if nothing more, almost for like informational. Hey, here's $100, or here's my co-payment. Can I just meet with you for an hour and get some pointers on co-parenting, how to explain this to my child? That would definitely be something that I would consider before filing a divorce if there's children involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing, if there is children involved, you still have that financial obligation for the children. Refusing to pay for daycare, refusing to cover your children's health insurance, any financial obligations that you're currently carrying for your children, you want to maintain those throughout the divorce case. You don't want to start shuffling those around in preparation for a divorce, because it's going to make you look like a bad parent. It's going to make you look like you don't care. Even if, I don't care what the circumstances are, you just want to keep everything as close to status quo as you possibly can prior to the divorce case, prior to filing for the divorce. The other thing is kind of changing gears a little bit when it comes to your finances or your job or your employment. People think that it's going to help them if they suddenly are unemployed, if they suddenly lose their job right before they file for divorce to try to get out of paying, alimony or child support. Or maybe you're the other spouse. Maybe your husband or your wife, they have a good job and they know the divorce is coming, so they quit their job. And they think that they're going to be entitled to more spousal support or child support. However, once you get into the divorce case, if it's true that you just up and quit your job, then you could be imputed income. The court can impute income to you when calculating child support or alimony. Again, it kind of comes to a dissipation argument. If you've willingly quit your job, or maybe you're self-employed, you're a contractor, and you just stopped accepting new jobs to show that your income has trended down over the last 3 to 6 months in preparation for divorce, so that you can show that you're making less money, and your alimony or child support can be reduced. The issue with that is that might help you temporarily in the divorce case. However, once you get your divorce case entered and you start picking back up, you go out and you get a new job, you start making money again, or in the situation where you're self-employed, you kind of start picking up activities, start making more money. Your ex-spouse can always just modify and bring you right back to court and show that you're making more money now. And they can get their child support recalculated, and they can get their alimony recalculated. So, we typically advise people from doing that. I'm sure that there might be lawyers out there that'll kind of give you that kind of advice. That's certainly not us. But, in discovery, if you get a good lawyer on the other side, or if it's happening to you and you get a good lawyer, there are arguments that you can make to have a court impute income, meaning the judge will acknowledge the fact that you're earning good wages and that you quit your job right before the divorce in order to artificially lower your income. And there's ways to get around that. So that's definitely not something that we would advise. And again, if you do something like that, your final divorce could always be modified based on you making more money in the future. So it's not going to really net you a lot in the long run to do that. And actually, you'll probably lose more money in the long run from decreasing your productivity or from being unemployed for a period of time. So we would advise against that generally.
Yeah. And then one very straightforward piece of advice, this is something that I tell all clients if they ask, what should I do before divorce? Is, for God's sake, do not send your spouse nasty text messages or emails, written forms of communication, which are going to be text messages and emails, or I guess maybe Facebook messages if you Facebook message your spouse, or Instagram DMs or something, whatever it is. Assume that every single thing you send them is going to be an exhibit one day. Whether it is or not, it's a different discussion, okay? Because rules of evidence and what's relevant, whole different topic that you don't care about. But when I get a case and I get a text message from an opposing counsel that was sent by a client, one of my clients, and it says, I'm going to take everything in the divorce. You're a effing, see you next Tuesday, or whatever it might say. That's mild compared to some. It just doesn't look good. It's not a good look. And here's how it practically plays out, whether or not, there's all sorts of rules of evidence, relevance, balancing tests, things like that. But at the end of the day, family law courts sit in equity, and they, in theory, just want to do what's right and just under the law. And what that means is that's a good thing. Okay, the judge just kind of wants to equalize things and whatnot at a very high level. But also, it's gonna be figured out if you're a good person or not. If you're trying your best and maybe you don't make a ton of money, or maybe you screw up every now and then, or have the DUI from 10 years ago or something, but as we sit here today, you're trying your best, you're doing your best, you're working, you're a good father, you're not drinking anymore, a court's going to see that, and there shouldn't be any issue getting you 50-50 time sharing or something like that. But when you start talking about like text messages that are sent where there's 4-letter words, calling, accusatory, just all this nasty stuff that goes on, whether it actually gets admitted into evidence and considered in a final judgment or a ruling or a motion or something along those lines is a whole different discussion, but it's probably going to be presented. And the judge might say, that's not really admissible, I'm not going to consider that, but they hear it. And it starts to get into that whole theory of preconceived notions and first impressions and stuff like that. So just from the very start, just if you don't have something nice to say, don't say it. Don't get into texting wars. You're not going to win anything. There's nothing that you're going to win by arguing with your spouse, by texting with your spouse or soon-to-be ex-spouse. You're not going to prove anything to them, okay? Remember, this is a highly emotional time. And you're hearing Matthew and I speak in a somewhat ideally calming tone or whatnot. And it's because this is what our job is we take the emotion out of it. Attorneys take emotion out of the divorce, and we talk about facts, logical responses, applications of the law to your facts, what we can do. And sometimes that results in some very difficult conversations. Sometimes it's very pleasant conversations. But nonetheless, remember, you're going through an extremely emotional time right now, and arguing over, who paid $200 to have the interior door repainted. In the grand scheme of life, do you care? And what do you get for that? You're just pissing off your spouse. You're breaking down any sort of relationship that you might have to get along. And in that example, you might have $200,000 in the bank. Who cares about a $200 door? And so don't lose sight of the longer picture, which kind of goes back to what I was discussing earlier. Don't think about this in short-term time horizons. Think about this in long-term time horizons, mm-hmm. when you're making decisions and things along those lines.
A marriage is it's really interesting. There's really not anything like a marriage. There's nothing really comparable to a marriage. What a marriage is it is a It is two things. It's both a relationship and a business. Okay? That's what marriage is. It's a relationship and a business. You can have a relationship without marriage, but there's no business component to it. A marriage is when you combine business and relationship into one. Marriage itself is a contract. You have to separate the relationship from the business when you're considering divorce or when you're going through divorce. You can argue with your spouse after the divorce case. You can argue with your spouse. You can hate your spouse. You can be bitter. You could be upset. You could be disappointed about the relationship, about the infidelity, about him or her just not being a good spouse, not caring about you, whatever it is. Keep that within the relationship bubble, okay? But when you're considering divorce and you're thinking about divorce, think about the business aspect of it. And that's where the logic comes in. And that's where you want to control your emotions. You have the rest of your life to digest what happened in your relationship. But you have a very short window of time to try to wrap up the business end of the marriage. And that's what it is that we help people. Obviously, we hear people, we talk to them, we talk to our clients, we hear the emotions, we try to be good lawyers, counselors, and we're happy to help clients kind of work through the relationship end of things. You don't want to let the problems in the relationship cloud your judgment and force you to make bad decisions about the business aspect of the marriage. It's very difficult because usually, divorces are happening at the tail end of the relationship. There's been a lot of stuff that's happened, some nasty stuff, and so it's very difficult to separate those two things. But remember that the marriage is both the relationship and the business, and the divorce is all about the business. It's not about the relationship.
One of the best succinct pieces of advice that I ever heard, I don't even remember where I heard it from, probably on a YouTube video or something, was don't make promises when you're happy and don't react when you're mad. Don't make decisions when you're mad, rather. And it makes perfect sense. When you're happy, if you're having the greatest day, if you just won the lottery or whatever it might be, you might say, "Oh yeah, I'll promise you, man, I got you the rest of your life. Don't worry about it." And then 2 months later, you realize, wait, what did I do? I promised him how much money or whatever it might be, right? So that's on the happy side of things. On the mad side of things, you get some sort of text or email from your spouse, or you log on to Facebook and maybe you find out that your spouse took a trip to Puerto Rico for the weekend with a new lover, and you get really upset about it. And so then you call up your attorney and you're just like, screw it, stipulation for the sale of the house is off. I want 70-30 time sharing with the kids because I'm the better parent. Well, you're making that decision because you're upset, and certainly it's a tough thing. It's emotional, everything along those lines. I get it, but is that really going to help anything here? So if you get really upset, don't just try to regulate your emotions and don't have that knee-jerk reaction that you're just going to go scorched earth. And the other thing too, then you get frustrated when you call your attorney and it's like, oh, well, I want to do this, this, and this. And then the attorney goes, well, if you really want to do that, it's going to be extremely expensive, probably not going to work, and it's going to take another 3 to 4 months to get hearing time on the motion. Then you get, it's just a vicious cycle. So to keep on topic for today's podcast, before you file for a divorce, start to play through the emotions that you're going to go through, because no matter how regulated you are, you're going to go through a cycle of emotions. You're going to be upset. There's going to be times that you're happy because your attorney sends you good news, or a hearing finally got set, or you got a final date for a date for your final judgment. Whatever it might be, there's going to be happy emotions. There's also going to be really sad emotions, and just at least at the very start, just recognize, just accept that you're going to go through those emotions. And then if you can take it one step further and promise to yourself, okay, if I'm really upset, I'm going to make a promise to myself that I'm not going to contact my attorney or direct him or her to do anything for 24 hours unless there's an emergency and my life's at risk. Because in my experience, just that 24-hour cool-off period gets you back into a clear head to where you can kind of get back and say, okay, well, just because my spouse went to Puerto Rico, yes, it sucks. Yes, I'm sad. Maybe I cried myself to sleep or whatever it might be. But as difficult for it as it is for me to admit this, they still are a good parent, and there's no reason why they shouldn't have 50-50 time sharing. But if you had that kind of knee-jerk reaction, you might just go down a course that just is no good for anybody.
Yep.
Pretty much covers it.
All right. Yeah. I mean, there's always more to know. There's always more to do in anticipation of a divorce. We're happy to speak with anybody that needs advice about what to do before a divorce. But I think what we went through are the major stumbling blocks, the major things that kind of trip people up before they get divorced. And that's really what we want people to understand and know. But with that, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Divorce Well in Florida, What to Know Before Your Spouse Does. Again, I'm Matthew Waring.
And I'm Brian Dunmire
Of Fairway Law Group, Florida Divorce Law Firm.